The antique watch fell to the ground, metal gleaming in the night. Lucas Reed looked at the woman trapped in the BMW on the railway tracks as a train horn echoed from the distance. "We don't have much time," he said softly, "but I'll get you out of here." Her eyes looked at him with desperation. He didn't know that the woman he was about to save would bring his family things they'd never had before. But he never asked himself why she had crashed on the railway tracks in the middle of the night like this. The scent of coffee mixed with motor oil filled Lucas Reed's small kitchen as he checked his watch for the third time that morning. 5:45 a.m. His daughter Zoe would be awake soon, and he still hadn't figured out how to tell an 8-year-old that they might have to move again. The stack of overdue bills on the counter seemed to mock him with their bright red stamps, each one a reminder of how far behind he'd fallen since losing his job at the auto shop 3 months ago. Lucas ran his calloused fingers through his dark hair, the same nervous habit he'd developed during his army days. Back then, he'd been Sergeant Reed, the guy everyone called when bombs needed defusing. Explosive ordnance disposal, they called it, a fancy name for crawling toward death and convincing it to wait another day. These days, he was just another single father in Cedar Falls, Texas, trying to keep his head above water while the current pulled him deeper. The familiar creak of floorboards announced Zoe's arrival before she appeared in the doorway, her auburn hair sticking up at impossible angles and her favorite stuffed elephant tucked under one arm. "Morning, Daddy," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. "Are we having pancakes?" Lucas's heart clenched as he looked at his daughter's hopeful face. Pancakes meant syrup, and syrup cost money they didn't have. "How about cereal today, sweetheart? I'll make it extra special with those banana slices you like." Zoe's smile didn't waver, but Lucas caught the brief flicker of disappointment in her green eyes, the same eyes her mother had before she decided that being a military wife was too hard and being a single mother in California was easier. "Okay, Daddy. Can I help?" As they moved around their tiny kitchen in practiced harmony, Lucas tried not to think about the conversation he'd had with Mrs. Patterson next door the evening before. The elderly woman had mentioned seeing a "for sale" sign going up on their rental house, which explained why their landlord had been so eager to collect this month's rent early. Another move, another school for Zoe, another chance to start over in a place where nobody knew them. The ritual of breakfast provided a temporary distraction from his worries. Zoe chatted about her upcoming school play, while Lucas packed her lunch with the last of the peanut butter and jelly. He watched her eat her cereal with genuine enthusiasm, marveling at how children could find joy in the smallest things. When had he lost that ability? When had everything become about survival instead of living? After dropping Zoe at school, Lucas spent the morning walking the streets of Cedar Falls, stopping at every business that might need an extra pair of hands. The hardware store, the diner, even the laundromat. All gave him the same polite but firm rejection. "Times are tough," they'd say, or "we'll keep your application on file," which everyone knew was code for "don't hold your breath." By evening, exhaustion had settled into his bones like an old ache. He'd picked up Zoe from her after-school program, helped her with homework, and somehow managed to cobble together a dinner from the dwindling contents of their refrigerator. Now, with his daughter safely asleep, Lucas found himself walking the railroad tracks that ran along the edge of town, a habit he'd developed when the walls of their small house felt too close and his thoughts too loud. The night air carried the scent of wild grass and distant rain. Stars scattered across the Texas sky like scattered diamonds, and for a moment Lucas allowed himself to remember when life had felt full of possibility instead of just problems. The track stretched endlessly in both directions, a steel lifeline connecting Cedar Falls to places where maybe, just maybe, things could be different. That's when he heard it, the screech of brakes, followed by the sickening crunch of metal meeting metal. Lucas ran toward the sound, his military training kicking in before his conscious mind could catch up. What he found made his blood run cold. A black BMW sedan, its front end crumpled against the steel rails, steam rising from under the twisted hood. Inside the car, a woman was slumped over the steering wheel, her blonde hair falling in waves around her face. She was breathing, but unconscious, and Lucas could see a thin line of blood trickling from a cut above her left eyebrow. The car's position across the tracks meant she was trapped, and in the distance he could hear something that made his stomach drop, the low, mournful wail of a freight train's horn. Lucas's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he assessed the situation. The driver's side door was jammed, but the passenger side might give him access. He circled the vehicle, noting the way the front wheels had become wedged between the rails and the underlying gravel. This wasn't just a simple accident. The car was positioned in a way that would make it nearly impossible for the woman to escape on her own, even if she regained consciousness. The train horn sounded again, closer now, and Lucas felt that familiar calm descend over him. The same feeling he'd experienced countless times in Afghanistan when faced with an IED that could level a city block. Time slowed, his breathing steadied, and the world narrowed to the problem in front of him and the tools at his disposal. He tried the passenger door first. Locked. The windows were intact, but the impact had somehow triggered the car's security system. Lucas looked around for something he could use to break the glass, settling on a chunk of railroad ballast that fit nicely in his palm. One sharp blow to the passenger window sent safety glass cascading into the car's interior like crystalline rain. The woman stirred as he cleared away the remaining glass and climbed halfway through the window. Up close, he could see she was probably in her late 30s, dressed in what looked like an expensive business suit that had seen better days. A briefcase had spilled open on the floor, scattering papers and what appeared to be photographs across the car's interior. "Ma'am," Lucas said gently, touching her shoulder. "Can't you hear me? We need to get you out of here." Her eyes fluttered open, blue as a summer sky, and surprisingly alert for someone who'd just been in a car accident. When she focused on his face, something flickered across her expression that Lucas couldn't quite read. Fear, maybe, or relief, or something else entirely. "I'm hurt," she whispered, though Lucas couldn't see any obvious injuries beyond the small cut on her forehead. "I know, but we don't have much time," he said, noting how the train's horn seemed to be getting louder. "Can you move your legs?" She shifted slightly, wincing. "I think so. Who are you?" "Name's Lucas. I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to trust me and do exactly what I say, okay?" The woman nodded, and Lucas began the delicate process of extricating her from the wreckage. It was like defusing a bomb in reverse. Instead of carefully disconnecting components, he was reassembling a human being from a puzzle of twisted metal and broken glass. He'd done this before too, though the circumstances had been different. Roadside bombs in Kandahar had a way of teaching a person how to move quickly and efficiently when lives hung in the balance. As he worked, Lucas noticed details that didn't quite add up. The woman's injuries were minor considering the apparent severity of the crash. Her car, while damaged, wasn't totaled in the way he'd expect from an impact violent enough to wedge it between railroad tracks. And there was something about her eyes. Too aware, too calculating for someone who'd just experienced trauma. But there wasn't time to ponder these inconsistencies. The freight train was close enough now that Lucas could feel the vibration through the soles of his boots. With one final careful maneuver, he lifted the woman clear of the wreckage and carried her to safety, just as the locomotive's headlight began to illuminate the scene with harsh, white intensity. They reached the gravel embankment just as the train rounded the curve, its engineer laying on the horn in a futile warning to a car that no longer contained a driver. The impact when it came was tremendous, a sound like thunder mixed with the screams of tortured metal. The BMW disappeared beneath the train's bulk, emerging on the other side as little more than scattered debris. Lucas and the woman sat in the tall grass beside the tracks, both breathing heavily from adrenaline and exertion. In the aftermath of the noise, the night seemed unnaturally quiet, except for the gradually fading rumble of the freight train continuing its journey south. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice stronger now. "You saved my life." Lucas studied her face in the moonlight, still troubled by something he couldn't quite name. "What were you doing out here so late?" "This isn't exactly a main road." She hesitated just long enough for him to notice. "I was lost. Took a wrong turn somewhere and ended up on that service road. I must have been going too fast when I tried to cross the tracks." It was a reasonable explanation, but Lucas had learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts were telling him there was more to this story. Still, the woman was safe. The immediate crisis was over, and he had his own problems to worry about. "You should probably see a doctor," he said, standing and offering her his hand. "That cut on your head might need stitches." As she took his hand, something metallic caught his eye in the grass nearby. It was a watch, expensive-looking, with an intricate face, and a band that gleamed like real gold even in the dim light. He picked it up and handed it to her. "This must have come loose in the accident," he said. The woman's fingers closed around the watch with surprising intensity. "Yes," she said softly. "It belonged to my father. I never take it off." But as she fastened the watch around her wrist, Lucas noticed her hands were steady. Steadier than they should have been for someone who'd just survived a near-death experience. And when she looked up at him again, there was something in her expression that made him think of poker players and politicians and people who made their living by convincing others to believe what they wanted them to believe. "I'm Veronica," she said, extending her hand with the kind of practiced smile that suggested she was used to making first impressions count. "Veronica Sterling. Lucas Reed," he replied, accepting the handshake while noting the strength of her grip and the absence of calluses on her palms. Whatever Veronica Sterling did for a living, it didn't involve manual labor. "Is there somewhere I could make a phone call?" she asked. "I need to contact my office. Let them know what happened." Lucas glanced at his own phone. No signal, which wasn't unusual out here in the rural areas around Cedar Falls. There's a gas station about 2 miles back toward town. They should still be open. As they walked along the dark country road, Veronica told him she was the CEO of a company called Sterling Industries, something to do with technology and government contracts. She spoke with the kind of casual confidence that came from never having to worry about money, and Lucas found himself both impressed and slightly resentful of her obvious wealth. "What about you?" she asked as they reached the gas station's harsh fluorescent glow. "What do you do in Cedar Falls?" Lucas hesitated, unwilling to admit to this obviously successful woman that he was currently unemployed and behind on his rent. I'm between jobs at the moment, he said finally. I used to be in the army. Explosive specialist. Something shifted in Veronica's expression, though Lucas couldn't tell if it was interest or something else. That must have been dangerous work, she said. It had its moments. Inside the gas station, Veronica made her phone calls while Lucas bought coffee and tried not to think about how the few dollars he was spending represented a significant portion of his remaining cash. Through the window, he watched her pace back and forth outside, speaking in rapid, urgent tones to whoever was on the other end of the line. When she finished, she approached him with that same calculated smile. My assistant is sending a car, she said. It should be here within the hour. Good, Lucas said, checking his own watch. I should probably head home. My daughter will be wondering where I am. You have a daughter? Zoe, she's 8. For the first time since he'd met her, Veronica's expression seemed genuinely soft. That's a wonderful age. Is her mother in the picture? No, Lucas said shortly, not wanting to elaborate on Rachel's departure or the custody arrangement that gave him full responsibility for Zoe while her mother played at being single in San Diego. I'm sorry, Veronica said, and she actually sounded like she meant it. Raising a child alone must be challenging. Lucas shrugged, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. We manage. They sat in the gas station's flickering fluorescent light, drinking bad coffee and making small talk until headlights appeared in the parking lot. The car that pulled up was a sleek black sedan with tinted windows, the kind of vehicle that screamed money and importance. That's my ride, Veronica said, standing. She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, pressing it into Lucas's hand. I meant what I said about you saving my life. If there's ever anything I can do to repay you... Lucas looked down at the card. Sterling Industries, with an address in Dallas, and a logo that looked like it had been designed by someone who charged by the flourish. That's really not necessary, he said. Maybe not, Veronica replied. But I always pay my debts. As Lucas walked home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, he found himself thinking about the woman he'd just rescued. There had been something odd about the whole encounter, something that didn't quite fit together properly. But then again, trauma had a way of making people act strangely, and he'd seen enough of both trauma and strange behavior during his time in the service to know that not everything had to make perfect sense. What he couldn't shake was the feeling that Veronica Sterling hadn't been entirely truthful with him. The story about being lost didn't explain why she'd been driving fast enough to crash through the railroad crossing barriers, and her injuries had been remarkably minor for such a violent accident. Then there was the matter of her composure. Most people who'd just narrowly escaped death tended to be more shaken up than she'd appeared. But these concerns faded as he approached his own front door and remembered the stack of bills waiting on his kitchen counter. Whatever secrets Veronica Sterling might be keeping, they weren't his problem. He had enough troubles of his own without borrowing anyone else's. The next morning brought the usual routine of breakfast, getting Zoe ready for school, and another fruitless round of job hunting. Lucas had almost forgotten about his encounter with the mysterious CEO until he returned home that afternoon to find a large bouquet of flowers on his doorstep, along with an envelope bearing the Sterling Industries logo. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note on expensive stationery. Thank you again for last night. I hope these flowers brighten your day the way your kindness brightened mine. V.S. Also in the envelope was a check for $5,000. Lucas stared at the check for a long moment, reading and rereading the amount to make sure he hadn't misunderstood. $5,000 was more money than he'd seen in one place since his discharge from the army. It was enough to catch up on his rent, pay the utilities, buy groceries for a month, and still have something left over for Zoe's school clothes. It was also way too much money for simply helping someone out of a car accident. When Zoe came home from school, she immediately noticed the flowers. "They're beautiful, Daddy." "Who sent them?" "Just someone I helped last night," Lucas said, still trying to process the magnitude of Veronica's gesture. "Must have been some help," Zoe said, with the kind of insight that 8-year-olds sometimes displayed when adults least expected it. That evening, after Zoe was asleep, Lucas called the number on Veronica's business card. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Lucas, I was hoping you'd call. Did you get my flowers?" "I did," he said, along with the check. "Veronica, this is too much. I can't accept this." "Nonsense," she replied. "As I said, I always pay my debts. Besides, I have a feeling this is just the beginning of a beautiful friendship." There was something in her tone that made Lucas pause. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking about our conversation last night. About your background, your skills. I might have a job opportunity for you if you're interested." Lucas felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of job?" "Security consulting," Veronica said smoothly. "Sterling Industries has several government contracts that require personnel with your specific expertise. The pay is excellent, and the work would be based here in Texas, so you wouldn't have to relocate." It sounded too good to be true, which in Lucas's experience usually meant it was. But as he looked around his small living room at the second-hand furniture and the stack of overdue bills, he found himself wanting to believe it anyway. "I'd need to know more details," he said carefully. "Of course. Why don't you drive down to Dallas this weekend? I'll show you our facilities, introduce you to some of the team. Bring your daughter if you'd like. I'm sure she'd enjoy seeing the city." After he hung up, Lucas sat in his kitchen for a long time, staring at the check and trying to figure out what he'd gotten himself into. Everything about Veronica Sterling screamed success and sophistication, but there was something underneath all that polish that he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't necessarily malicious, but it wasn't entirely honest either. Still, when Saturday morning arrived, Lucas found himself loading Zoe into his aging pickup truck for the drive to Dallas. The Sterling Industries building was impressive, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that rose 40 stories into the Texas sky. The lobby was all marble and chrome, with abstract sculptures that probably cost more than Lucas made in a year, back when he was making anything at all. Veronica met them at the elevator, dressed in another expensive suit, and wearing that same calculated smile Lucas was beginning to recognize. She'd clearly made an effort with Zoe, bringing along a gift bag filled with art supplies and a stuffed unicorn that made his daughter's eyes light up with genuine delight. "Daddy, she's so nice," Zoe whispered as they rode the elevator to the 38th floor. The Sterling Industries offices were as impressive as the building's exterior suggested. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the Dallas skyline, and the furnishings looked like they'd been selected by someone with unlimited budget and exquisite taste. Veronica introduced Lucas to several employees, all of whom seemed genuinely friendly and competent. The job offer, when it finally came, was everything she'd promised and more. Head of security operations, with a salary that was nearly 3 times what Lucas had been making at the auto shop. Full benefits, company car, and opportunities for advancement. All he had to do was oversee the security protocols for Sterling Industries government contracts and occasionally consult on matters requiring his EOD expertise. It seems almost too good to be true, Lucas admitted as they sat in Veronica's corner office, while Zoe played with her new art supplies in the adjacent conference room. The best opportunities usually do, Veronica replied, but I've learned to trust my instincts about people, and my instincts tell me you're exactly what this company needs. As Lucas looked out at the city sprawling below them, he tried to identify the source of his uneasiness. On paper, everything about this opportunity was perfect. The salary would solve all his financial problems, the work was in his area of expertise, and Veronica seemed genuinely committed to helping him succeed. But there was something about the way she watched him when she thought he wasn't looking, something calculating and predatory that reminded him of the dealers and con artists he'd encountered during his time overseas. It wasn't that she was lying to him exactly, but she wasn't telling him the whole truth either. "I'll need some time to think about it," he said finally. "Of course," Veronica replied smoothly. "Though I should mention that we'd need someone to start as soon as possible. This Monday, ideally." The pressure was subtle but unmistakable. Lucas had been in enough high-stakes situations to recognize when someone was trying to force a decision before he had time to think it through properly. But he also recognized the reality of his situation. This job offer might be his only chance to provide the kind of life Zoe deserved. "Okay," he heard himself saying. "I'll take it." Veronica's smile was radiant. "Wonderful. I'll have my assistant prepare all the paperwork. You and Zoe should celebrate tonight, maybe dinner at that nice steakhouse downstairs." As they rode the elevator back down to the lobby, Zoe chatted excitedly about their new life in Dallas. Lucas tried to share her enthusiasm, but the feeling of uneasiness was stronger now, settling in his stomach like a lead weight. That night, as they sat in the expensive restaurant Veronica had recommended, Lucas watched his daughter's face light up as she tried escargot for the first time. This was what he wanted for her. Opportunities, experiences, a chance to see the world as something bigger than their small apartment in Cedar Falls. So why did he feel like he'd just made a deal with the devil? The answer came sooner than he expected. On his first day at Sterling Industries, Lucas was given a security clearance packet that required him to list every detail of his military service. As he filled out the forms, he noticed that several of the questions seemed specifically designed to identify personnel with EOD experience. When he asked his new supervisor about it, the man's explanation was vague. "Government contracts," he said with a shrug. "They're very particular about background checks." But as the days turned into weeks, Lucas began to notice other things that didn't quite add up. The Sterling Industries building had remarkably tight security for a technology company, with armed guards and metal detectors that seemed more appropriate for a military installation. Several floors were completely off-limits to most employees, accessible only with special clearance that Lucas didn't have, despite his supposed position as head of security operations. Most troubling of all was Veronica herself. She seemed to know more about Lucas's background than she should have, referencing specific missions and incidents from his time in Afghanistan that weren't part of any public record. When he asked her about it, she always had a reasonable explanation: connections in the defense industry, routine background checks, lucky guesses based on his obvious competence. But Lucas had learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late October. Lucas had been working late, trying to finish a security assessment that seemed to have been designed more to test his knowledge than to actually improve anyone's safety. As he prepared to leave, he noticed that the light was still on in Veronica's office. He was walking past her door when he heard her voice, speaking in urgent, hushed tones to someone on the phone. Something in her tone made him pause and listen. "Don't care what the FBI thinks they know," she was saying. "We've been careful. And even if they did have something concrete, they'd need access to the servers, which they are not going to get." Lucas felt his blood run cold. FBI? Servers? What kind of technology company was Sterling Industries really running? "Reed is perfect for this," Veronica continued. "Military background, EOD training, and desperate enough to not ask too many questions. If something goes wrong, he makes an excellent fall guy." The words hit Lucas like a physical blow. Fall guy. Veronica hadn't hired him because of his qualifications or his character. She'd hired him because he was vulnerable and expendable, someone who could be set up to take responsibility if whatever Sterling Industries was really doing ever came to light. Lucas backed away from the door as quietly as possible, his mind racing. Everything made sense now. The car accident that had brought them together, the job offer that was too good to be true, the way Veronica seemed to know so much about his background. None of it had been coincidence. But as he stood in the hallway outside her office, Lucas realized something else. If he was right about what he'd just overheard, then Veronica Sterling was involved in something that had attracted FBI attention. And if he'd learned anything during his time in the army, it was that people who attracted FBI attention were usually the kind of people who eliminated loose ends. People like him. Lucas left the building that night with his mind made up. Whatever game Veronica was playing, he wasn't going to be a pawn in it any longer. But he also knew he had to be smart about this. If she really was as dangerous as he suspected, then disappearing without explanation would only confirm her suspicions and put both him and Zoe at risk. He spent the weekend in Cedar Falls, ostensibly visiting friends, but actually making preparations. He moved what little money he had to a new bank account, made copies of all his important documents, and began putting together a go-bag with essentials for both him and Zoe. On Monday morning, he returned to Dallas with a plan. He would continue working at Sterling Industries while quietly gathering evidence of whatever illegal activities they were involved in. Once he had enough proof, he would take it to the FBI himself and hope that cooperating would be enough to keep him and his daughter safe. But Veronica Sterling hadn't become CEO of a major corporation by being careless or trusting. On Tuesday afternoon, as Lucas was leaving the office, he noticed a black sedan following him. On Wednesday, the same car was parked across from Zoe's school when he picked her up. By Thursday, he was certain they were being watched. That night, after Zoe was asleep, Lucas sat at his kitchen table and tried to figure out his next move. He could run, but Veronica had resources and connections that would make it difficult to disappear completely. He could go to the police, but he had no concrete evidence of wrongdoing, just suspicions and an overheard phone conversation. The answer, when it came to him, was both simple and terrifying. If Veronica Sterling had orchestrated their first meeting, then she'd been planning this for longer than he'd realized, which meant she'd been watching him, studying him, learning his patterns and weaknesses before she ever crashed her car on those railroad tracks. Lucas walked to his bedroom and pulled out a small metal box from under his bed. Inside, wrapped in an old army t-shirt, was his service pistol, a Colt .45 that had been his constant companion during 3 tours in Afghanistan. He'd never expected to need it again, but as he checked the magazine and worked the action, muscle memory took over, and he felt a familiar calm settle over him. He wasn't going to run, and he wasn't going to wait for Veronica to make the first move. If she wanted a confrontation, she would get one. But this time, it would be on his terms. The opportunity came sooner than expected. On Friday afternoon, Veronica called him into her office with a request that he drive to Austin that evening to conduct a security assessment of a new facility. It was exactly the kind of isolated, after-hours scenario that Lucas would have chosen if he were planning to eliminate a potential threat. "I'll need you to leave right away," she said, handing him a manila envelope with driving directions and building access codes. "The assessment needs to be completed before Monday morning." Lucas took the envelope and nodded. "No problem. I'll head out as soon as I pick up my daughter from school." Something flickered across Veronica's face. Actually, this might be a good opportunity for Zoe to have a sleepover with one of her friends. The assessment could take most of the weekend. "I'll figure something out," Lucas said, keeping his voice neutral while alarm bells rang in his head. The fact that Veronica wanted Zoe out of the picture confirmed his worst suspicions about what this Austin trip really entailed. Instead of picking up his daughter from school, Lucas called the principal and arranged for Zoe to spend the weekend with her friend Sarah's family, a precaution that he hoped would keep her safe, regardless of what happened to him. Then he drove to Austin, following the directions in Veronica's envelope, while constantly checking his rearview mirror for signs of pursuit. The facility turned out to be a warehouse complex on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by chain-link fence and largely hidden from the main road. Lucas parked in the empty lot and sat for a moment, studying the building and planning his approach. If this was a trap, whoever was waiting for him would expect him to walk through the front door like an unsuspecting victim. Instead, Lucas circled the building on foot, looking for alternative entrances and exit routes. What he found was more disturbing than he'd expected. The warehouse was filled with computer servers and electronic equipment that looked far more sophisticated than anything a legitimate technology company would need. More importantly, he recognized some of the equipment from his military days, communication devices and data encryption systems that were supposed to be restricted to government use. As he moved deeper into the building, Lucas began to understand what Sterling Industries really was. The servers weren't just storing data, they were processing it, analyzing it, and redistributing it to destinations all over the world. This wasn't a technology company, it was an intelligence operation, and probably not one that had official sanction from the United States government. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out," a familiar voice said behind him. Lucas turned to find Veronica standing in the doorway, no longer bothering to maintain her facade of corporate respectability. She was dressed in black tactical gear and held a pistol with the kind of casual competence that suggested she'd used it before. "How long have you been planning this?" Lucas asked, his hand moving slowly toward his own weapon. "Since the day I first read your military file," Veronica replied. "Did you really think that car accident was coincidence? I needed someone with your specific skills and background, someone who could be manipulated into position and then eliminated when they became inconvenient. What is this place?" "Think of it as a private intelligence service. We collect information for clients who are willing to pay premium prices for data that governments would prefer to keep secret. Your EOD background made you perfect for accessing secure facilities, and your financial desperation made you easy to control." Lucas felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. Anger would get him killed, and he had a daughter who needed him to survive this. "The FBI knows about you." Veronica's smile was cold. "The FBI suspects, but they can't prove anything. And after tonight, when they find your body alongside evidence that you were selling classified information to foreign governments, their investigation will shift focus to cleaning up the mess you made. You're going to frame me. I'm going to eliminate a liability and create a convenient scapegoat. 2 birds, 1 stone. Lucas had heard enough. In one smooth motion, he drew his pistol and dove behind a rack of servers as Veronica's first shot sparked off the concrete floor where he'd been standing. The warehouse erupted in gunfire and shouting as Veronica's backup team revealed themselves from their hiding places around the building. What followed was a running battle through the maze of equipment and storage areas. Lucas had the advantage of military training and combat experience, but Veronica's team had superior numbers and better knowledge of the building's layout. For every tactical mistake they made, they could afford to make another. He couldn't afford to make any. As bullets whined past his head and equipment exploded around him, Lucas found himself thinking about Zoe. She was safe for now, but if he didn't survive this, how long would it be before Veronica decided that an 8-year-old girl represented another loose end that needed to be tied up? The thought gave him strength and clarity. He stopped retreating and began to fight back with the kind of focused violence that had kept him alive in Afghanistan. One by one, Veronica's team members fell to precisely placed shots and improvised explosives created from the building's own security systems. When the smoke cleared, only Lucas and Veronica remained standing. They faced each other across the ruined warehouse, both wounded, both determined to end this on their own terms. "You can't win," Veronica said, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead where flying debris had struck her. "Even if you kill me, there are others." "This organization is bigger than you can imagine." "Maybe," Lucas replied, keeping his pistol trained on her center mass. "But you won't be around to see what happens next. What about your daughter? What happens to her when you're in prison for murder?" It was a desperate attempt at psychological manipulation, but Lucas had been through too much to fall for it now. "I'm not a murderer, Veronica. But I am a father, and fathers protect their children." The final confrontation lasted only seconds. Veronica tried to use her apparent surrender to get close enough for a surprise attack, but Lucas had been expecting it. When she moved, he was ready. In the aftermath, as Lucas sat among the wreckage waiting for the police to arrive, he thought about the phone call he'd made before leaving Dallas. Agent Sarah Chen of the FBI had been very interested in what he had to tell her about Sterling Industries, especially when he'd offered to provide evidence in exchange for protection for himself and his daughter. The investigation that followed would expose one of the largest corporate espionage operations in U.S. history. Sterling Industries had been selling classified information to foreign governments for years, using a network of corrupt officials and compromised personnel to access data that was supposed to be secure. Lucas's cooperation with the FBI earned him immunity from prosecution and relocation assistance for himself and Zoe. They ended up in a small town in Montana, where Lucas found work as a security consultant for legitimate companies, and Zoe could grow up without the shadow of her father's past hanging over her. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when his daughter was doing homework at the kitchen table, Lucas would think about that night on the railroad tracks when he'd first encountered Veronica Sterling. He'd saved her life without knowing that she'd planned it all along, that his act of heroism had been nothing more than the opening move in her elaborate game. But in the end, it had been his willingness to risk everything for someone else that had given him the strength to protect what mattered most. The skills he'd learned in the army had kept him alive, but it was his love for his daughter that had given him a reason to survive. "Daddy," Zoe said one evening as they sat on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson, "do you ever wish things had been different? That we'd never met her?" Lucas considered the question carefully. If he'd never encountered Veronica Sterling, he'd still be struggling to find work in Cedar Falls, still worried about paying rent and putting food on the table. The trauma and danger of their ordeal had been terrible, but it had also led them to this new life, where Zoe could pursue her dreams without the constant anxiety of financial insecurity. "No, sweetheart," he said finally, wrapping his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "Everything that happened brought us here, to this moment, and I wouldn't trade this moment for anything in the world." Zoe leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Even the scary parts?" "Especially the scary parts," Lucas said. "Sometimes the things that frighten us the most are the things that teach us how strong we really are." In the distance, a freight train's whistle echoed across the valley, but instead of the ominous warning it had once represented, it now sounded like a promise of journeys yet to come. Lucas closed his eyes and listened to its fading call, remembering the antique watch that had fallen in the gravel that night, its face catching the light of approaching danger. Veronica had meant that watch to be a symbol of time running out, of lives measured in minutes and seconds before everything changed forever. But sitting here with his daughter in the gathering twilight, Lucas understood that time wasn't something to be feared or manipulated. It was a gift, each moment an opportunity to choose love over fear, truth over deception, and hope over despair. The investigation into Sterling Industries had revealed the full extent of Veronica's deception. The car accident had been staged, her injuries faked, even her apparent vulnerability carefully calculated to appeal to Lucas's protective instincts. She had studied him for months before their first meeting, learning his routines, his weaknesses, his desperate desire to provide for his daughter. But what Veronica had failed to understand was that desperation could be transformed into determination, and that a man fighting for his child's future was capable of extraordinary things. She had seen Lucas as weak because he cared more about others than himself, but that caring had ultimately become his greatest strength. Agent Chen had told him that Veronica would spend the rest of her life in federal prison, along with dozens of co-conspirators who had been part of her espionage network. The governments and organizations that had purchased stolen information from Sterling Industries would face their own reckonings, diplomatic and otherwise. As for the antique watch that had started it all, Lucas had kept it as a reminder of how close he and Zoe had come to losing everything. It sat now on his nightstand, its hands frozen at the moment of impact, a permanent monument to the night when everything changed. "Daddy," Zoe said softly, interrupting his thoughts. "Mrs. Anderson at school asked if you'd be willing to teach a class about safety and first aid. She said the other kids would really benefit from learning from someone with your experience." Lucas smiled, remembering how Veronica had tried to use his military background against him, turning his skills and knowledge into weapons for her own purposes. But here was an opportunity to use those same abilities to help and protect others, to turn the darkness of his past into light for the future. "I think that sounds like a wonderful idea," he said. As they sat together watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Lucas felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The road that had brought them here had been dangerous and painful, but it had also taught him valuable lessons about trust, resilience, and the difference between genuine kindness and calculated manipulation. He thought about all the single fathers out there who might be facing their own moments of desperation, their own encounters with people who would prey on their vulnerabilities. If his story could help even one of them recognize the warning signs and protect their family, then perhaps all the pain and fear had been worth something after all. "Are you happy here, Zoe?" he asked, wanting to be sure that the choices he'd made had been the right ones for both of them. His daughter looked up at him with eyes that sparkled with contentment and security. "I'm happy wherever you are, Daddy," As long as we're together, anywhere feels like home." Lucas hugged her closer, overwhelmed by the simple truth of her words. Veronica Sterling had tried to destroy their family by exploiting the love between them, but that same love had ultimately been their salvation. It had given Lucas the courage to fight when fighting seemed impossible, and the wisdom to know when to trust and when to be suspicious. The train whistle sounded again, fainter now as the locomotive carried its cargo toward distant destinations. Lucas listened until the sound faded completely, then stood and helped Zoe to her feet. "Come on," he said. "Let's go inside and make some hot chocolate. I'll tell you stories about the stars." As they walked toward their front door, Lucas caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. The man looking back at him was older than the desperate single father who had walked those railroad tracks in Cedar Falls, but he was also stronger, wiser, and more at peace with himself and his place in the world. Behind them, the Montana sky stretched endlessly upward, filled with stars that had guided travelers for thousands of years. Each point of light represented possibility, hope, and the promise that even in the darkest moments, there was always a path forward for those brave enough to take the first step. Sometimes the most dangerous encounters led to the most profound transformations. Sometimes the people who tried to destroy us ended up revealing strengths we never knew we possessed. And sometimes, in saving someone else, we discovered that we had been saving ourselves all along. The antique watch on Lucas's nightstand would tick no more, its mechanism forever frozen at the moment when two lives collided on a dark Texas night. But the real measure of time wasn't found in the mechanical precision of gears and springs. It was found in moments like this, a father and daughter sharing stories under a vast sky, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. That night, as Lucas tucked Zoe into bed and kissed her goodnight, she asked him one final question. "Daddy, if you could go back and change what happened that night on the railroad tracks, would you?" Lucas considered his answer carefully, thinking about all the pain and terror they had endured, but also about the strength they had discovered and the new life they had built together. "No, sweetheart," he said finally, "because everything that happened, even the bad parts, led us to right here, right now. And right here, right now, is exactly where we're supposed to be." As Zoe drifted off to sleep, Lucas stood in her doorway for a moment, watching the peaceful rise and fall of her breathing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight his daughter was safe. They were together, and they were home. And sometimes that was more than enough. Sometimes that was everything.